Of course, Rit and Ben were happy to have their 7-year-old daughter back with them again, but they were worried too. Minty had not pleased her mistress. They knew that she had not tried hard to learn to weave. Slaves who didn't work hard were sold. Rit and Ben also worried about the Brodus plantation. Once it had raised tobacco. It had been a rich plantation. Then the price of tobacco dropped. Mr. Brodus had tried raising wheat and corn and then cotton, but nothing paid as well as tobacco had. The Brodus plantation was becoming run down and seedy. But there was one thing Mr. Brodus still raised profitably, and that was slaves. It pleased him that Rit and Ben now had 11 children. Each child that was born was worth money to Mr. Brodus. He raised slaves the way some ranchers raise cattle. When he needed money, he hired them out or sold them. Rit and Ben lived in fear that Mr. Brodus would sell the rest of their children. It would break their hearts, but there was nothing they could do to stop him. Rit grumbled that she should be free. When her old master had died, he left a will that said so, and if she was free, her children should be free. But in 1828, black people like Rit and Ben had no rights. Before long, Minty was hired out once more. Again, a wagon took her far from her home. At last it stopped in front of a house. It was much finer than the cook's cabin, but not as fine as the Brodus house. The house belonged to Miss Susan and her husband. During the day, Minty's job was to help Miss Susan and her visiting sister, Miss Emily, with the housework. At night, she was to care for Miss Susan's baby. The first morning, Minty was told to sweep and dust the parlor. Minty had never seen such a fine room as that parlor, but she didn't know how to begin sweeping the soft carpet or dusting so many tables and chairs. But she got a broom and swept the carpet as hard as she could. Dust swirled into the air. Then she got a cloth and dusted the furniture, but the dust from the carpet was still in the air. Slowly it settled on the newly dusted furniture. Miss Susan came into the parlor. Minty watched as she ran her finger over the table. Her finger made a streak. The table was dusty. Miss Susan yelled at Minty. She called her stupid. She told her to do it again and to do it right. Minty was frightened. She'd swept and dusted as she'd been told. She didn't know what she'd done wrong. Still, she tried again. But when she finished, Miss Susan still found dust on her table. Miss Susan got her whip. She whipped Minty over and over again. The child screamed in pain. "Susan, Susan," Miss Emily's voice called over the screaming. "What are you doing?" She had heard Minty's cries and had come downstairs. "Why do you whip the child for not doing what she's never been taught to do?" Miss Emily asked Miss Susan to leave Minty alone with her for a few minutes. Then she showed Minty how to sweep and dust the right way. Minty spent her days cleaning. When she wasn't cleaning, Minnie took care of Miss Susan's baby. Years later, she remembered, "I was so little, I had to sit on the floor and have the baby put in my lap. And that baby was always in my lap, except for when it was asleep or its mother was feeding it." But Minty's nights were the worst. Miss Susan did not want to be disturbed by a crying baby. She wanted a good night's sleep. So Minty had to rock the cradle back and forth so the baby wouldn't cry. At last, the baby would fall asleep, then Minty could sleep too, on the floor beside the cradle. But often, the baby woke up crying in the middle of the night. Then Miss Susan would leap out of bed. But she did not run to comfort her baby. Instead, she grabbed a whip that she kept on a little shelf close to her pillow. Angrily, she would lash Minty. How dare she let that baby wake up her mistress? Soon, Minty hardly slept at night for fear that the baby might start crying. She became exhausted. Then, she couldn't work well. And when she made a mistake, Miss Susan would thrash her with a whip. The back of Minty's neck became covered with scars that remained all her life. Minty thought of running away from Miss Susan, but she was afraid. She had no idea where she was. How could she ever find the Brodus plantation? She would probably be caught, and she knew what would happen then. Slaves who tried to escape were whipped and branded like cattle with a big letter R for runaway. Sometimes their masters cut parts of their ears off. And then the next time a trader came from the deep south, the slave would be sold and sent away in chains. One Friday morning after breakfast, Miss Susan was holding the baby. Minty stood by the kitchen table, ready to take it from her. Miss Susan was quarreling with her husband. She scolded him and called him all sorts of names. As Minty waited for the baby, she looked down at the kitchen table. Her eye caught a bowl full of sugar cubes. Minty had never tasted sugar in her life, but she knew from the way people talked about it, it must be good. Miss Susan's back was turned. She was screaming at her husband. Minty didn't think she'd notice if she took just one lump. But as she reached out toward the bowl, Miss Susan whirled around. She screeched at Minty and snatched up her whip. Minty didn't stop to think. She simply flew out the door and ran. Miss Susan and her husband chased after her. But Minty ran too fast for them. She ran past many houses. But she didn't dare stop. Everyone in the area knew Miss Susan. They would just send Minty back. At last, Miss Susan and her husband stopped chasing Minty. But she ran. She still ran. Finally, she was too tired to run any farther. She slowed down. After a while, she came to a great big pig pen. An old sow lived there with about 10 piglets. Minty managed to tumble over the fence and into the pen. She was so exhausted that she could not move. Minty hid in the pig pen for 5 days. She fought with the piglets for the potato peels and the other scraps that were thrown into the trough. But the mother sow would push her away. She wouldn't let Minty eat any of her little pig's food. At last, she was close to starving. She couldn't survive in the pig pen. She had nowhere else to go, so Minty went back to Miss Susan's. Minty nearly died from the whipping Miss Susan gave her. Then Miss Susan shoved her into the wagon and took her back to Mr. Brodus. "This girl," she told him, "isn't worth a sixpence." Once more, Rit nursed her near-starving child. She washed off the dirt from the pig pen and put herbal medicines on the fresh whip marks on Minty's neck. Little by little, Minty gained weight and became healthy again.